Reverend, please come quick. 'Cause I got something to admit. I met a man out in the sticks, a good old miss. He drove a Series 10 Cadillac and wore a cigar on his lip. Don't you know the devil wears a suit and tie? Saw him driving down the 61 in early July. Wide as the cotton field and sharp as a knife. I heard him howling as he passed me by. He said, I know you, young man. Well, I know you by the state of your hands. You're a six-string picker, just as I am. Well, let me learn you some. I know a few tunes to make all the girls dance. Don't you know the devil wears a suit and tie? Saw him driving down the 61 in early July. Wide as the cotton field and sharp as a knife. I heard him howling as he passed me by. Oh, foolish, foolish was I. Damn my foolish eyes. That man's lessons how to price the sweet price. My sweet soul, everlasting, my very own eternal light. Don't you know that?
Welcome, everybody. We have CJay Engel from the Austro Libertarian, writer for the Mises Institute, here with us today. What's going on, man?
Nothing. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you, man. I've been excited about this interview since I don't know what, it's been like a month.
Yeah, I kept putting you off, but we're here.
Well, no, I mean we kept putting each other off. I think it falls on both of us. There's no bad blood here. Calm down.
Yeah, well, it's always good to be busy, and doing video streams is something that I'm new to. So I was happy to try it. And I think I canceled on you once, and then you went on a trip somewhere, so we didn't. Yeah, we're finally here though.
I was in the wrong state to be doing anything like this. So
yeah.
How's things in the daily life of CJay?
It's busy. I'm always doing all kinds of stuff and trying to get it all done within my narrow window of work hours. I have kids, of course, and so I can't just do everything all the time. But, it's busy and it's hot. I'm in Northern California and it's way too hot for me. So that's also a miserable constraint on my life. But I can't complain. I got a pretty good setup. So,
where are you from originally?
Oh, I grew up here in Northern California,
and I haven't. It's still too hot.
Oh yeah. Well, I grew up in the mountains. There, like in between California and Nevada, there's the Tahoe region, and
sure.
It snows there and it's cold, and that's kind of what I consider home. But now I live down in the valley. It's and when I say too hot, it's not like Phoenix, Arizona hot, but it is mid 90s, and anything above 80 is miserable for me. So that's what I have to deal with until the winter.
Phoenix, Arizona hot's just misery though.
Yeah,
So
well, I mean, I can't tell a difference when it's over 90. It's just all.
You'll feel it when it's 120 though. Good night.
Yeah, that's when I hide.
Right, I'm just staying inside with the AC on at that point.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
so how long how did you get into libertarianism, capitalism? What got you into the movement?
Well, I was a Ron Paul guy. I mean, I think I was in my junior year, I guess, when he started campaigning his second time in 2011, junior, senior year. That's when I was introduced to him. And I've always been kind of, I'm very personally, conservative, and that's just my personality and my background. But I've always had sort of a style to me that likes to be likes dissent, from a conservative standpoint. And so,
Sure.
my wife she was doing like political stuff in college. That was kind of her major, and I was a business major. And so I saw what she was doing, and I thought it was kind of cool. But they, her and her group, they always knew what they were talking about. And I figured I should probably know some things. My family's all Republicans, neoconservative background. So, that was 2011. So, it was kind of the heyday of Mitt Romney and that whole thing. And so I just kind of followed in those footsteps. And, of the typical Ron Paul's great, he's fine, except for on foreign policy. And I think his obsession with the central bank is kind of wonkish and weird. But, as I started looking at, I was really into, what does it mean to be a constitutionalist at that time? So I really started studying it, and I was able to see a certain style of consistency about him that kind of was attractive to me, because while everyone was flocking around the most polished guy, which would be Mitt Romney, and definitely not Ron Paul. He's not polished. He's not, he's not up on stage in this, perfect, presentation, perfect suit, perfect shoes, perfect hair.
With
He's
the
kind of
teeth.
just himself, and so
Right.
I kind of was a little bit standoffish to that. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this guy was really attractive to me just because of how consistent he was. And so he appealed to that side of me that wanted to be different from the typical neocon. And I've always wanted to be a little bit different, a little bit pushback. I liked a little tiny bit to agitate against, the common way of seeing things, which in my small town and my, Christian community was very neoconservative, nationalistic, imperial, pro-military, that whole culture. And so part of me was starting to push back on all that. So I was a product of that, and then of course, by the time I was ready for my senior paper, I was doing it on the Fed because that was his thing. And then, of course, once you get into studying the Federal Reserve and you get introduced into all these Mises, books and essays, it kind of is a domino effect from there. So it's kind of a typical story for people in their 20s, early 30s, late 20s. But yeah, I kind of followed that route.
Okay. And so you grew up in a Christian house, and is that correct? Your
Oh
parents
yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely a Christian house. So in Northern California, there's like this. It's like well known, like in Christian circles, it's well known for what's called like the Calvary movement,
Yeah.
and that's kind of where I grew up. So very, very culturally neoconservative. Very, very much. There's a doctrine called dispensationalism. That's a big aspect to the thinking, in the world that I grew up in. So yeah, I grew up definitely in a Christian household, very, very, very right, very Newt Gingrich type, conservatism and all that. So that was kind of my own background for sure.
Okay. And so, I mean, I think most people's observation of Christianity as a whole, for those that aren't too familiar with, where you or I come from, necessarily, they see a lot of flag waving, pro-war, anti-immigration types, and why do you think that is? Why do you think that tends to be? I mean, it's a good observation. I would say that it's definitely a majority position. Why do you think that might be?
I think in evangelical circles, right? So that would be like a broad term to encapsulate a
Sure.
lot of different, conservative Christian. It became part of this political movement, right? So there's the moral majority. This was this in the 70s and 80s. There was this effort to try kind of, take back politics from the new left, right? So during the 1960s and early 70s, there was this rise of the social progressive left. In the post World War II time frame, and everything was going socially progressive, and so the kind of the conservative outcasts in that sort of social setting really got together and created what they called the moral majority, where there was this emphasis on uniting conservative Christians into an actual political force. And so I think not only did that corrupt government and politics, right, but it also corrupted Christianity and religion too, because it kind of seeped in and blurred the lines. And that's when you really had this whole phenomenon of like, patriotic songs in churches and flags on display in churches and all that kind of stuff, which, just even decades prior to that, that would be kind of at odds with this idea of Christianity as this distinct community within a secular society. So there's always this strong difference between the state and its governorship of all of society and the church itself, which is this like set apart thing. But when you blur it all together, it becomes this, very statist mishmash of vaguely Christian referenced political ideas. And so they feed off of each other. And so I think that led to a corruption of evangelical Christianity in the late 80s, especially in the 90s. And when you had people like, Bill Clinton, come to term, you had a lot of that like, conservative revolution type stuff in response to it, but everything was blurred. There was no underlying principles. It was all just this national identification effort that had no real bearing in what, you or I or others might consider a more, restrained Christian understanding of what the state should be doing.
Right. So, I mean, it was more of a counterculture kind of thing at the time, and then that was adopted to become more or less a doctrinal position. Being pro-America is. Go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And then, of course, Reagan, helped fuel that mentality, that momentum, that sort of national conservatism, that kind of basically was the rise of neoconservatism. But, it's interesting if you look at how these neoconservatives came into the GOP, they came from the left, right? They came from the Democratic Party, and they were frustrated with the anti-right movement of the Democratic Party during those years. So they decided that they needed to come into the GOP and find more pro-war voices. And that was kind of at the same time as Reagan was trying to, push out these internationalist, trilateral commission type globalist Democrats. He was trying to push that out of the GOP. He was successful in doing so, but the only problem is that he created a chasm that the neocons came in and filled. So, all along it's been this, after the death, after World War II, this sort of, Rockefeller, big government, international conservatism kind of branched over both parties. When Reagan came in to try to uproot that, he basically created a void, and the neocons came in. And of course, they used the same language as the Zionist evangelical community. And so they were able to create, this kind of revamped and even more confused and blurred Christian, nationalist movement. So it's all politics, and politics corrupts everything. Politics corrupts business, it corrupts culture, and therefore it also corrupts religion. If you're not into religion, I still think it's interesting to look at how politics corrupts everything it touches,
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I'm an anarchist. I think you probably figured that out at this point. And so a question I get a lot of times is how do religion and anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism, how do those come together? Can they come together? Not necessarily just Christianity, but religion as a whole. I mean, as I understand it, obviously we're looking at something more decentralized than most people tend to think when you argue for anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism, etc. How do you think those go together, or do they? Can they consistently marry, I suppose?
I think there's a lot of different ways that people interested in religion have tried to do this. Some have emphasized the tolerance or peace-oriented teaching of Christ, and they've kind of gone that direction. My own, I guess, personality and mentality on these things is that Christianity specifically offers a standard by which everybody needs to apply themselves. So there's this transcendent moral set of stipulations that no one should be exempted from. So, Christians, we always teach our children, don't hit other people, don't create violence, don't murder them, respect other people's property. These are kind of vague things that we learn when we're kids, especially in Christianity. I mean, there's an entire tradition of teaching that in Christianity. So I think one of the important parts of, Christianity, as I've come to understand it, is that no one is exempt from that standard. If there's going to be a moral standard like that, it can't be for some and not for others. Everyone has to adhere to it. So that's the kind of the justice angle of libertarianism. There's all kinds of different formulations and justifications for libertarianism, broadly speaking, kind of come from that justice-oriented tradition. But if justice is important, then it's kind of unjust for someone to be exempt from that transcendent moral standard. So that's kind of where I come from. When you apply that to everybody, I don't think you can avoid the logical implications of anarchism or a non-state society. And I'm always very technical on this point. So I'm not like anti government or governance in a broad sense. I still think that there should be rules. I have this ordered liberty mindset where there should be rules. That one of the most important rules for libertarianism is to respect other people's private property. That would be a very key core fundamental rule for libertarians. But when you apply that consistently across the board, you begin to realize that there's this distinction between the state as an entity that deviates from that moral standard that I mentioned, and governance as this role in society that's useful, that people need in order to have an actual successful society. So my version of anarchism is anti-state, but not necessarily anti criminal prosecution or things like that.
Yeah, hang on, the stream dropped for a second. I'm pulling it back up.
Okay, sure.
Sorry about that. All right.
Not sure if any of that was caught off.
Some of it was, but not all of it. So you're the last thing you said was you are anti-state, but not necessarily. Elaborate on that last point a little bit for me. Sorry, I was caught off guard.
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to describe it is there has to be, first of all, there's a rule, right? You're not allowed to transgress other people's property rights. That would be a rule. Mm-hmm. And men aren't angels, right? So there's going to be some people that steal things or murder people or in various other ways breach people's private property rights, right? We don't live in this utopia. People do bad things. So given that, there has to be a role. There is a legitimate function for somebody to do something to address that problem. So what I do is I distinguish between the state, which by its very nature transgresses private property rights, right? So by its very nature, it undermines the rule. But there's a distinction between the state as this entity that by definition does those things and the role itself. So in my perspective, I think that like if there was no state and I owned this house and someone came into my house, it would be within my legitimate rights to, basically fight him off and protect, what's mine. So I can also outsource that to another agency to do that on my behalf. I think that's all legitimate. So there's you can call that role a governance role.
Sure.
But I distinguish between that role and the state itself, which preemptively taxes me, takes my money without my consent and tells me, therefore, the price of the services that they're going to provide without my consent and does it for me. So I distinguish between the entity and the role itself. So my anarchism is very technical, but at the same time, I don't deny the legitimate function of some agency doing something to prosecute criminals, to provide for defense and things of that nature.
Right. So, I mean, you would argue for the privatization of things like security. Even would you go so far as to say justice, or would there just be some kind of natural law over everyone that would be agreed upon, or what would you say that looks like in that society? Would that be a community agreement?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think that one of the great things about figuring this out is that we don't have to create a blueprint for everybody to follow. And I think that some models tend to prefer, there's an anarchist philosopher, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who prefers this kind of covenant community model where everyone agrees that the land within a certain jurisdiction has to abide by these certain stipulations and functions for that type of thing. And then there's the more, you could say the entrepreneurial, aspect of things, which emphasizes things like insurance companies and contracts and things of that nature. So it's less covenant community oriented, but it's more, I'm trying to think of the right word, but it's more dynamic. You think of it more like this would be more akin to like a city where everyone's kind of doing their own thing and they work things out with, entrepreneurs and businesses that provide these types of functions in the society. So I think either one of those are legitimate. But I think that one of the important points is the state has monopolized both security and justice rendering. They've kind of taken both of those and kind of meshed them into one. So when we think about the legitimate functions of the state, we actually think about protection and prosecution as kind of one function. But I think, if we didn't have a state that had monopolized these things, I think these would be thought of more as two functions. So,
sure,
communities would have a security aid, and a lot of them today, like if you look at a homeowners association in a gated community, a lot of them have private security anyway. So I don't think it would be any different. It's definitely not something that can't be pictured because we have it now. We always supplement, the socialized or publicized security provision, but under those arrangements, there would be a distinction between the security provision, protection services, right? Because we live in a modern society where, well, not everyone wants to sit on their porch with a gun at night, right? So we outsource that function to a security agency that is, better skilled in providing those services. But that's an entirely different function than criminal prosecution. Once a crime has been committed, what happens to the criminal himself? That's the prosecution, not the protection. Those are very different services. The state kind of blends them all into one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we're starting to see even that privatization become not necessarily mainstream. It's definitely not mainstream, but we're starting to see it actually work when we look at places like Detroit right now. The city can't pay their police officers anymore. I mean, everybody's sick of being a cop in Detroit, and so a lot of people are actually hiring private security forces. And seeing that actually work is a really nice case study, I suppose, in favor of separating those two. So we got a pretty good question here in the chat, and I think this kind of comes into the issue of decentralization. How do you prevent corporations and factions from becoming so powerful they become the de facto state? I actually hear that question a lot more often than you would imagine. But
well, I think one of the first things to say to this type of question is that, first of all, if it were to become the case where a corporation would become a de facto state, we actually have no difference than what it is now. So it's not like things would be worse somehow. It would just be, that's exactly what happened, basically, Right. But I think in general, when people begin to realize that it's better for something to be privately owned than publicly owned, we have this scenario where the corporations themselves respond to market demand. They respond to people choosing their services, and therefore, since the income and revenue toward them is voluntary,
Thanks, Obama.
so the everything becomes profit oriented. And so one of the problems with the state, and one of the problems with a publicized ownership of an agency like that, is the funds that they can expend on things like aggression and war and all that kind of stuff that they do. It's not their money that they're losing. So they can spend billions of dollars on destroying lives all around the world, and they don't have to take a loss on it. They don't feel the pain of that. In fact, they probably benefit from it, because of the crony relationships and stuff. So if you have a situation where things are privately organized, it's in their best interest to pursue peace, to avoid conflict, because it's just so expensive. It can be completely damaging to their operations and to their potential profit potential. The other thing too is I think that a lot of these types of protection agencies, and security provision agencies, I think that they would need to have insurance in case there's a really big problem, like a mass shooting or something. They would need to have insurance, because a situation like that would bankrupt them. And so the insurance companies, in order to keep the premiums down and to be able to manage their own risk, would ensure that the corporations are managed by sane people, that would manage by people that would make decisions that are in the best interest of the insurance company, of the shareholders, of the corporation, of the society as a whole. So there's this profit-oriented mechanism that I think prevents abuse that is completely lacking in a socialized, publicly owned, security provision agency.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into a little bit about libertarians as far as the movement goes. What libertarianism looks like today. Let's talk practically. Kind of. What do you think? I saw that you got shared by Liberty Memes this morning. What do you think of the liberty movement today? What are libertarians doing right? What are they doing wrong? Give me your perspective.
Yeah, this is a tricky question, because I'm a lot more blunt about things when I'm in writing than I would be here, speaking orally. I'm not as confident in my ability to precisely say what I mean. So
sure.
In general, as a personality trait, I can kind of be cranky, and pessimistic about things.
Sure.
That's just part of my personality. So when I interpret the liberty movement, I kind of have this "we're all doomed" mindset often.
Sure.
But I don't think I'm that wrong on that. I have this tendency to prefer, intellectual and philosophical discussions over anything else. And so, because that's such a rare, personality, and that's such a rare, aspect of the modern world. Everything's Twitter oriented, short, simple,
right.
Easily accessible. I don't fit in a lot, and so when you ask me for my interpretation, it can kind of come across as pompous and arrogant. So
sure.
But the way I do see things is like, look, I believe that libertarianism. It's tempting for me to say that it's been tainted and overcome by leftism, by tendencies to think of libertarianism as sort of a socially progressive mood, instead of just a principled idea of property rights and justice, which is the way I interpret it. So when you
Sure.
distort that into, well, libertarianism means that people can do whatever we want, and everything can run amok, and we have the degradation of society, and we have all this other stuff that people love to see happen. I kind of take a more conservative personality approach to all that. So I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic. And that's I kind of see libertarianism as going the way of general culture and just, falling apart. So I'm not that hopeful about the libertarian movement. And so that's just kind of my own shtick as I focus on, the more overarching social and cultural concerns. So when you ask me for my perspective, I'm probably going to be in the minority on being very pessimistic, but there's also people like me that tend to be more optimistic. There are a lot of guys at the Mises Institute, they're doing this Mises University week in Alabama right now. And so a lot of those guys are more optimistic. And when you hang around them and kind of see the feedback and response that you get from people all over the world, it's very easy to be optimistic. And so I think that there are, what I call rays of hope here and there. But I live out in California in the most socialist, progressive state. So I can get a little bit jaded sometimes.
Of course. So, I don't know if you follow Michael Malice at all, but he tweeted at Tom Woods last night, apparently being destroyed by Bob Murphy, and he pretty well just dumped on Tom, which was pretty funny.
Well, Tom had the disadvantage though, because he was going into the debate. Tom was in heavy favor, and when you have the Oxford style voting, that's that doesn't work in your favor.
No, not at all. So libertarians and what they can do essentially to start, seeing success in the movement, I think stems a lot from entrepreneurialism and starting businesses and making their money the right way. Do we see libertarians doing this? What do you think? I know that Mises is making a push to discuss more. I mean, I actually just got an email today about their entrepreneurship motives and things like that. What do you think that landscape looks like for libertarians in business right now?
Well, I think that people are realizing that the state-oriented path that's been set up for a lot of people is not working. I think that this idea of you need to go to, through high school, then college, then you get your, master's and doctorate degree. You need to do this until you're in your 30s in order to actually be worthy of entering the marketplace. I think that's very damaging to people's minds. I think it's damaging to their prospects, and it is completely incapable of preparing them for a dynamic and technologically driven world. I think everything that we're taught by the state and its grasp on the education system is so completely backwards that it's causing a lot of, social anxiety and social frustration, and people are coming out with debt, no prospects, no skills, and a bunch of theory that has no applicability to the way things actually work, especially with regard to the, dynamic nature of the marketplace and so forth. So with libertarians aware of the corrupting nature of the government and its hand in the education system and everything else, its effect on the cost of living, its effect on, the ability for businesses to thrive and profit in this setting. I think libertarians are becoming aggravated with that entire, socio-economic system, that they're looking to do things their own way, and so when you have a libertarian entrepreneur that's like, look, these are all the requirements that the government wants me to have. These are everything that they're saying about, starting a business, paying taxes, paying fees, filing for licenses, all this stuff. I think libertarians are just ignoring all that and doing it anyway. And I think that's good. I think that they need to. I think that's the path forward. I think putting a lot of political capital and weight and emphasis on the political process can be, produce a lifelong frustration about the inability to make anything good happen. And so I think the more that libertarians look to entrepreneurship, starting a business, and bettering their communities, I think we're going to have a lot more success and be happier people.
Absolutely. And so you've started a few businesses. You have the Austro Libertarian, and now you have the magazine that you started a few months ago. What were some of the hurdles? What has you excited about what you're doing? And what is some advice you would give to people, to libertarians particularly, that are starting businesses, not necessarily in the media sphere?
Well, yeah, it's funny because I'm...
That's like three questions, so good luck.
Everyone's telling me print is dead. Why are you doing a print magazine?
Right.
So I think the first thing I would say is do what you want, and make it happen. And I think kind of as a subset of that, don't let the government get in your way. I think that I've started several businesses and I'm aware of the financial restraints that can prevent one from complying with all the various rules and regulations. I mean, look, I live in California, and the business regulations here, I think, are a little bit more arduous than elsewhere in the country. And so I'm aware of the, frustrating effect that can have on entrepreneurs. So my thing is do it anyway. Just ignore it. If you can't afford a business license, do it anyway. Make a profit, then pay for your business license and get legit later. I think people worry about getting all their ducks in a row legally, and they think that the IRS, which is of course a very dangerous institution that can destroy your life, but just be aware of the fact that if you're going to make $5,000 profits in your first year, if you're going to make $5,000, they don't care about you. Take advantage of that, build up something, then get your house in order. And if they come back later and get you in trouble, well, by then you would have already made the money to handle whatever they're going to throw at you. So I think it's better to just do it anyway. And I think the more people do that, the less they're going to be able to prevent it. I mean, there's always news articles where people are lamenting and crying over the fact that they actually can't do their jobs of collecting the right revenue because there's not enough staffers. Of course, that should make libertarians everywhere extremely happy and optimistic that they can't do their jobs. But I think that's exactly right. I think people are becoming more and more just aware of the fact that there's not this like mysterious moral obligation that we have to do whatever the IRS says. And so people are going to do what they want, and the IRS isn't going to be able to stop everybody doing that at once.
Almost sounds like you're down to storm Area 51.
Yeah. I'm the guy that provides the goods and services for them to go storm Area 51.
Right, exactly. I'll provide the t-shirts. You provide, the water or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I live in California, so like the gold rush is like a big part of where I live, and so we always heard about the people who took advantage of the poor miners by selling them shovels, and I always thought that was pretty cool. So.
Yeah, really. Really taking advantage of those poor guys. Jeez.
Yeah.
Making things easier. Capitalism sure sucks. For sure. So tell me about your interactions within the Mises Institute with some of those guys, some of the writers, highs and lows. How long have you been there? I know you're not officially a Mises Institute, employee, but I know that you contract and write and do things like that, and have had some interaction there.
Yeah, I think my first article would be in 2015, maybe 14 or 15. So I kind of, got to know them that way. And then I was asked to do some various projects here and there with them over the years. So I've gotten to know Jeff Deist, who's the president, and Tho Bishop, and some of those guys. I've gotten to know them pretty well over the years. And, I just completely, I love everything about that place. It's my favorite place in the world. I love the people. I love their optimism, and they're extremely nice. There's all these libertarian factions, and Mises Institute gets blamed for being, nasty or whatever. But I think one of the things that struck me about the Mises Institute and their people is just how kind they are to everybody who's interested in what they're doing. Obviously they're very distrustful of reporters and people from the Beltway, from, Washington, D.C. There's stories of, Washington Post reporter or journalist trying to do